John is a soulful, loving man, always giving and supporting others above and beyond. He's also a person of deep intuition, a sort of mystical man who feels everything and everyone. John energetically brings out the truth in those he meets. His way of being is indescribable and triggers a contagious yearning within those who enter his aura. I can't describe it any other way except that when John enters my energy space, it shifts to an equilibrium of acceptance and peace. I know I'm loved. What is not a mystery is that John's mandate in life is to achieve a sense of belonging intentionally and consistently, and he intentionally and consistently provides this to everyone he knows. You're about to experience John's story of From There to Here and how he discovered the feeling of belonging.
I love you so much.
Thank you so much. Oh, this feels good. Just want to make sure the microphone's where it is. Last time I spoke, apparently I was a low talker. So I'm hoping you can all hear me pretty good. All right, wow, it's a neat experience. And I wish upon each of you, at some point, maybe the same experience. So, about 10 years ago, this very season, I was sitting in a sacred healing circle with about 20 other people, mostly Aboriginal, a combination of social workers, co-workers, clients, and teachers and leaders in the First Nations community. And I was so excited to be there. It was a week-long retreat for personal empowerment held at Mount Washington. And I was equally ecstatic that I had just landed a job in my field as a family support worker for the Aboriginal Friendship Center in Nanaimo. I can tell you that that week-long experience was so transformative that it did more for me than years of healing. And I discovered within myself a very deep wound, a very primal wound. And it was a belief that I simply did not belong. I suppose it started when I was 4 years old in my family. And I don't have a whole lot of memories from that period of time. But I lived with my mother, my 2-year-old sister at the time, my maternal grandmother, and my father in a small apartment in the suburbs of Montreal. I do remember that I was deadly afraid of my father. As one might say, he had a terrible temper. When I was 6 years old, I received the first beating of my life with a belt. It wouldn't be the last beating, and over time, the belt would not suffice. I received 6 lashes, and I was told in advance by my father exactly what was going to happen. He sat me down and explained he needed to punish me because I lied. I was 6 years old. In those days, it was quite a walk. I was coming home from school. It was wintertime. I was traveling with a friend. I was picking icicles off everywhere, including under cars. And he came out, they were worried, and he saw me. And I got home. Where were you? And I lied. And so he told me that he needed to punish me. 6 lashes, he told me. And with every lash and in every pause, in my 6-year-old mind, I was absolutely terrified. The pain, the shock, the humiliation. When it was over, I told myself that I would never lie to my father again. Of course I did. But I told myself that I never wanted to make him mad again. And that was the beginning of my living in fear. To say that my father was a mentally ill person does not even begin to describe the levels of his paranoia. He would take offense to anything, the smallest of offenses, in fact, imaginary offenses, and he would juice himself on the rage, and he would direct it to each member of my family. The physical violence that each of us experienced was one part of the nightmare. There was constant threat of violence, always verbal threats of violence, emotional abuse, name-calling, humiliations, and on and on. When I was 6 years old, when I was in grade 6, and I was 10 years old, I suddenly became the victim of bullying at school. And I would remain with those classmates for 3 years, enduring that bullying, and it was a living hell. Unless you have been bullied yourself, you cannot possibly know what that experience is like. It started, of course, with the name calling. Paki, for Pakistani, they weren't even smart enough to know the difference. Faggot, living piss. John DeFreakus was one of the more creative names. And I endured this constant mocking and harassment every single day, even in classes. And the teachers did absolutely nothing. So I continued on picking up the pieces. And over time, I started to grow. And by the time I reached high school and I was in my teens, I started to learn a few things. I learned that maybe if I just ignored the bullying, it might stop, or at least diminish. And sometimes it did. But also, I was progressing, advancing incredibly in music and singing. And I was beginning to get roles in the school shows that were all lead roles, and I blew all of my classmates out of the water. I developed friendships, real friendships, friendships with older students, and even the popular ones. Towards the end, so many of my former classmates came to me and said, "John, I can't believe how much you've changed." And I said, "Thank you. Thank you." After successfully auditioning for and transitioning to the very first performing arts high school in all of Canada, the very first class of its year, I finally discovered an entire school of friends, an entire school of teachers who were friends, and that would begin a journey that would transform my young life. At the same time, at home, I learned to disconnect from my emotions and my family, and I spent every possible waking moment outside of it. Countless hours after school, rehearsing for shows, spending time with friends, playing the piano alone for hours and hours, and it was blissful. At a certain point in time, I realized that my father was simply a brute and insane. And I drew up my courage. I disconnected from my home life, and I created my self-esteem out of fire and ashes and the realization of who my father really was. Over a period of time, I would move on and out of that home and start a new life. There came a time as well, while I was still at home, where my father was discovering his Jehovah God. Now you have to understand, he kept finding and losing his Jehovah God. At that point in time, I didn't care. I was 14 years old, I knew I was gay, and I did not care that his Jehovah God hated me for being homosexual, and that I was doomed to death. His opinions were irrelevant, but at the time I also lived in a society where gay and lesbian people were barely tolerated, and we were responsible for AIDS, and we were dying of AIDS. But I will tell you, in that time of struggle, the lesbian and gay movement, the solidarity grew, and it was a revolution. And it would pave the way, years later, for a world where we now have will and grace. And I love will and grace, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, even as a legally married gay man, I could see how much further we could go, especially when it came to truly tolerating, embracing the very vulnerable children who are coming up, traveling a similar path. In terms of racism, most of us have a pretty good idea of what it's like in the world, particularly in Canada and the US. And I can only say, for my brothers and sisters of color, there have always been countless reminders of racism. When I lived in East Vancouver about 12 years ago, I was walking home from work to the SkyTrain, and I was passing a young man, and relatively nondescript, blonde hair. Just as he was passing, he looked me directly in the eyes, and he said, "Nigger." And I was shocked. And I turned around, and there he was, looking me in the face, and he was smiling contemptuously, as if to say, "What are you going to do about it?" Well, I was pretty much speechless. And then I turned around, and I went on my way, and the whole experience just settled in like yet another memory, yet another reminder of what some people think my place in this society really is. Along my travels, I've been fortunate, and I have discovered so many courageous tribes. I worked in the Aboriginal community, the First Nations community, for over 3 years, and I learned about suffering. I learned about generations of suffering and pain, and that told me everything. I also learned that I was a member of many courageous tribes. First generation Canadian South American, visible minority, proud gay man, survivor of trauma and abuse, and major depression, and several suicide attempts. I was a mental health consumer and a mental health advocate, a social advocate, and so the list goes on. A member of so many tribes, for which I am so very, very grateful. And you know, as I talk, I've completely forgotten the last part of what I memorized. But that's okay. You know, at the end of the day, belonging, we all belong together. Each of us in our suffering, we share that at least as belonging. And I've come just to celebrate the many human tribes out there doing good, spreading the word, bringing us a different kind of God, bringing us a God, a culture that would believe in peace, nature, compassion, loving kindness. And to be honest, it would take me many years of forgiveness for me, for so many wrongs. In 2018, here we are, I actually have a really beautiful life. I have a wonderful life. I have a free life. I have a husband and partner for 23 years. Thank you. I have family living here in Parksville. I have a community that I have simply fallen in love with. And I have a tremendous life. And it took me a while, but I realized that I simply had to accept myself. I had to accept it. And I had to accept that I was good enough for the world, good enough for God. And here's a little secret for everyone. Just to be alive is enough. Now, I have walked this road, but I am in good company with so many walking wounded healers and teachers and people on their own path, and it has been an incredible journey. These days, I mostly spend my time focusing on all the brilliant, gorgeous things coming out of our human tribes. I celebrate our stories. I celebrate our victories. And most of all, the remembering that each one of us is deeply connected. Thank you for listening to my story.